All right. So, Connor, how's it going?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Good. Do you prefer Connor Dykes or are you still going by Crystalline Wyvern?
You can call me Connor.
Okay. So, let's say I had a podcast that Connor listened to that was about the masculine and feminine. And that was my podcast with my friend Alyssa. And you also attended the masculinity discussion that I gave at the Stoa about
Yeah,
a
the
week
modern.
ago. Anyways, so Connor and I have talked before once in a different event, and we had actually talked about this topic, right? Which was masculine, feminine, and yin and yang, and sort of the intersection of those ideas as sort of a quadrant, you might say, or a masculine yang and masculine yin, and a feminine yang and feminine yin. And I think at first that might be confusing because we sort of sometimes think of yin and yang as being this masculine and feminine thing, as if they're like synonymous. But I think what we're going to try and get at today is that they're not actually synonymous, that they sort of have an interaction, perhaps, and what that means. So, yeah, you watched this video by Eisenstein, Charles
Yep.
Eisenstein. Is that kind of where this idea came from?
Yeah, he kind of gave me the language to put together something that had been on my mind without the vocabulary for it for a while. So I was really appreciated that, and I just wanted to flesh out that idea more because I thought it had potential.
Do you think you can kind of explain your ideas of how you might differentiate between yin and yang and feminine and masculine?
Yeah. So I'll first kind of go with what he put out there, and then
Yeah,
we add what I wanted to bring into it as well. So
yeah,
he tried to connect it to like very basic biological stuff. You can just see it as symbolic, but
mm,
you have the masculine yang as like the phallus. So that would be assertive, aggressive, forceful, onward and upward, exploratory, linear. And
yeah,
then the masculine yin would be like the testes. So patient, conservation of energy and force for the right moment,
mm,
stoic, resilient and enduring, like the reliable rock sort of metaphor,
yeah,
discipline, disciplining power, but like into gentleness. So you kind of have self control, that sort of thing.
yeah,
Like the capacity for having the capacity for violence, but keeping the sword sheathed, that sort of
right,
thing that's going around. And then the feminine yang, or I guess I could start with feminine yin since it's more stereotypical, as like the womb. So receptive, passive, nurturing, all encompassing and inclusive, circular, agreeable. And then the feminine yang, which I guess doesn't exactly have a body part, maybe like the birth canal, but he said like the
yeah,
birthing process.
yeah,
So like pushy, uh, demanding in the sense of like testing men, testing quality. And so in that more like almost angry aspect, it would be like, I will not put up with this. That's Charles Eisenstein's quote specifically.
mm,
Uh, that kind of energy, but also talkative and sociable, connecting people, can be like excitable and like bringing people together and having like social harmony. So in that sense, also it can be kind of like an enthusiastic, going with the flow sort of energy as well.
mm.
And I thought that differentiation was really good because I think there's like perhaps understandable dualism because our mind works so easily with dichotomies to just map them both one to the other.
Yeah.
But I thought there was something more, there was more nuance there that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, and so there's kind of this idea that what is expressed in our society typically is the masculine yang and the feminine yin, right? It's like that's sort of like the more stereotypical version of um, these energies, but that the masculine yin is something that's also present within us that isn't maybe as readily expressed in our society for various reasons that maybe we could get into. And same with the feminine yang, is that that is a kind of way of manifesting one's energy, but it doesn't really have a place to express itself in our society for various reasons, perhaps. So um, perhaps maybe one of the reasons we sort of think of when masculine and feminine are out of balance or they're not being expressed appropriately, or sometimes we think of men as being feminine in a negative way. Let's say it's that this idea that the masculine yin is not allowed to express itself properly for some reason, or the feminine yang is not allowed to express itself properly. And that's when we get this sort of weird gender clash or distortion of energy that we view as sort of being like a vice or a negative thing, perhaps. So like the idea that the masculine feminine, let's say, if a man is being feminine, that perhaps they are behaving in a way that is sort of wimpy and passive. And we don't really see that as being virtuous. We see that as being sort of a strange distortion of who maybe they should be. And that the feminine being masculine, or women taking on a masculine role, they might have to embody what it means to be a man, which is sort of aggressive and kind of violent, maybe, in a way that again sort of distorts who they are. And that's a more virtuous way of being. And this is like what Eisenstein says in the video, right? Is that like the masculine yin, a virtuous masculine yin might be like patience, right?
Yes.
That's kind of how he starts the video, is that like it's not being wimpy, it's being sort of someone who has control, someone who knows how to step back and maybe embody a more passive receptive role, but like in a virtuous way, in a way that we see as being good and positive.
Yeah, I think it ties very much to the notion of like being the rock in the storm. He was talking also in the context of like when a man is having to deal with like his female partner's anger, like there's three easier perhaps but less healthy responses of like lashing back or cowering or disassociating and closing up, whereas a proper healthy expression of the masculine yin would be kind of like weathering the storm and like being solid there for her, and still like maintaining a healthy perspective throughout it while still listening to her. Yeah.
Do you have any ideas of like why perhaps in our society, let's say, why like the masculine yin doesn't get to express itself as readily? Why do you think that is?
Yeah, this is really interesting to me. I mean, for one, you could make the argument that all kinds of yin are always kind of in the shadow, like they're not as obvious. So especially like I think to some extent in a culture that's very transparent, advertising and so on, very globalized, like there's not a lot of private sphere anymore. It's not as emphasized. In some sense, both kinds of yang are even more visible to an extent. And I think you could also make something of an argument that like feminism encouraged women to have more of that active role, and perhaps in a sense like they originally like in terms of being industrious and going into the workforce, that looks more like masculine yang, but at the same time, just due to the fact that most women have primarily like the feminine qualities, I view it as kind of, I don't know, maybe like 85%, like the anima and animus. You still have that bit of the other, so you can actually understand and model what the other person is like, but you have a dominant energy. It kind of translated into still a feminine yang energy, just naturally in a sense. And so in some ways, I guess I see like the masculine yin as of all the four being kind of the one that has been de-emphasized and therefore might be kind of having like a resurgence, or like a trying to have a shadowy take its place back. I think that might be a huge jump. I had the thought that it might be sort of like the response of the wave of more like closing up the borders, like nationalism, also like the popularity of I think Jordan Peterson also embodies the masculine yin very much, like self-discipline and so on, that sort of thing, to compensate for just like opening up of all the connections of the feminine yang, even though it was originally meant to be like women taking on the masculine yang, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the idea that the masculine yin is like the least expressed, is that what you were kind of saying? That it's like the most
just currently, I guess I would say, or it's like having a resurgence right now because it was kind of de-emphasized for a while.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because we do have this notion that women taking on sort of masculine qualities or taking on the roles of men, that seems to be a little more acceptable than the opposite. Whereas like men taking on feminine qualities or taking on the roles of women, there's much more of a backlash to that. from men themselves, but sort of the kind of culture we have, and it's hard to say whether or not this is a biology or if this is just purely a cultural thing. It's hard to know, but that like when feminine qualities appear in men, it's often something that is like sort of violently responded to almost, and men tend to give each other a really hard time for embracing these qualities. Let's say of being maybe a little more of a listener, maybe someone who kind of sits in the background, maybe someone who kind of waits to react. Or if men are being sensitive, if they're in touch with their emotions, or if they the idea of a man crying is something that like you just like don't really see very often. And when you do see it, there tends to be this sort of attitude of like it's kind of like sad or maybe even sort of like disgusting in some way. And it's hard to know why that is, but I think I agree that the in this framework, the masculine yin would probably be the thing that has been the most repressed over time, and is having the most difficulty coming out. But it is coming out now, I think. And I think you're right. Jordan Peterson, I think, is embodying this, and also I think a lot of the what I perceive as a lot of the intellectual discussion that's happening right now, and a lot of the people who are coming together over the internet right now are sort of embracing this masculine yin, I think, in a way that's sort of new, or at least it hasn't been around for a while, maybe. But what do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I
Yeah.
think in some sense it's like a response to just like the excess of options and like the consumerism, like having some kind of internal structure.
Yeah.
In some sense, you could kind of map the four to like masculine yang is extroverted thinking, masculine yin is introverted thinking, like internal order versus external order.
Okay.
Feminine yang is like extroverted feeling, like harmony among the group. But then I have to admit the one that doesn't really map that well is feminine yang to introverted feeling, because that's more
Okay.
of like strong internal values. Maybe I'm not sure about that one, but the other three kind of seem a little similar to me.
Interesting. So you're kind of mapping yin and yang to introversion and extroversion, right?
Yeah, that's part of the main argument I would say I would want to make to some degree. I think there's something
Yeah.
to it.
That's interesting because this notion of extroversion introversion, I think, is a pretty fascinating one. It's kind of complex. We did an episode on extroversion introversion in my podcast of trying to kind of like get it, like what are we really talking about when we say extroversion introversion? Because we have these stereotypes of just like, well, if you're quiet, you're introverted, and if you're not, you're extroverted, or something like that. And it's like that's too simplistic.
Yeah.
But this notion, the introversion is this axis of introversion and extroversion is kind of revolves around this notion of boundaries, where it's like the boundaries or the borders you have with the external world, how open are they, right? So if you are an introverted person, that those borders that everyone has them, everyone has borders between the internal and the external in a sort of like an energetic way. It's sort of this kind of vague thing, but if you're introverted, your energy doesn't flow too readily between the outside and the inside. You kind of keep the energy protected. And the extroversion is sort of this idea of like the borders are open and you allow the outside and inside to mingle a lot. And that means that like an introverted person is someone who kind of tends to be self-sufficient or maintain an internal environment very strongly. Whereas an extroverted person is someone who kind of allows the world to pour into them and for them to pour out into the world. And so I think that's an interesting idea of how to map this. The idea that
I'm open to the possibility that they're orthogonal, because the receptivity of yin is somewhat analogous to that open borders as you described. So they're probably not a perfect mapping, but I just feel like there is some kind of at least just using this kind of language is helpful, because like we were saying before with the imbalances, I think to some degree like feminism tried to get men to acknowledge their feminine side, so perhaps like the feminine yin because it's the most stereotypical. And that is an aspect, just I think, of the human psyche that we all have some degree of access to, even if it's less so generally in men. But there was probably some kind of overcompensation of emphasis on that, and then and then in response, an overcompensation in the opposite direction of like re-emphasizing the masculine yang, super men's rights sort of thing,
Yeah.
without kind of realizing that there's an energy that's, I don't know if you could say in between, but there's a third energy of the masculine yin that um, doesn't embody either of those stereotypes and is a little bit more allowing to mediate between those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that this notion of yin and yang, um, do you think it's something that sort of like predates humans, right? Something that kind of transcends humanity, you might say, like, um, this notion that yin and yang is sort of a passive, active force of the universe in some sense, and that the way that it manifests in us is just sort of an expression of that, being sort of channeled through this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I remember we discussed this a bit before.
Yeah.
It's definitely an idea that is probably like attractive and helps to organize a lot of things, at least for our own psyches. And
Yeah.
obviously, the Chinese and Taoism worked for that. I mean, I'm open to the possibility, but
Yeah.
so if we assume that is the case, just going with that, I would
Yeah.
think that if there's metaphysical forces or patterns predating the evolution of sexual differentiation in the first place,
Yeah.
then like the unique conditions of our evolutionary heritage that shaped our psyches through natural selection would have pillaged from both sides of yin and yang for what was most needed, like in the context of that species. So for us as hominid hunter gatherers,
Yeah.
just yeah, I mean, you can also look at other animals, like the different kinds of sexual dimorphism. Certain like seahorses and black widows, the males either take care of the eggs or are smaller, for example.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine if yin and yang are such deep metaphysical patterns that predate sex, then the sexes would have aspects of each within them, and that masculinity and femininity would, in some sense, be a different axis.
Mm. Right. So this notion that men, what we're talking about, right? So is that the men have both a yin and yang inside of them, and that women have a yin and yang inside of them. And I think to explore this from like an evolutionary perspective is interesting, and to think about how. I mean, it depends on your metaphysics, right? That's kind of what we're talking about. Is like what is the metaphysics here? Is if yin and yang are sort of oscillations within the universe. So like forces that bring together or create structure and order versus forces that sort of disintegrate that order, and they kind of breathe. So it's like the yin and yang breathe, they dance with each other, and as they do that, things like come into being as a process of this. And I think because I think you can see that like in our everyday life, and I think you can see that in people. This sort of idea that we have this sort of yin and yang breathing, where we we build ourselves up, we integrate things into our being, we absorb things, and then we have to sort of wash some of that stuff away. We have to kind of like get rid of what's dead. We have to sort of shed things, and so there's sort of that deconstruction, and then you have to like reconstruct. And so you're kind of building yourself back up and then breaking yourself down, building up and breaking down. And as you do this, like you grow, right? You kind of become a person. I think the sort of the Jungian idea of individuation sort of is like sort of talking about this, of becoming whole, becoming the person you're meant to be. And so this like sort of construct, deconstruct, yin yang thing, I think, is at play in almost everything. It's pretty abstract. It's hard to really identify where it's at play and where it's not. But the idea that sex is in some sense an expression of this, that perhaps there is some harnessing of these forces to best create growth, and that humans as living organisms, as evolving organisms, they grow, they become over time. And men sort of have this sort of yang aspect to them of the constructor, and women have sort of this yin aspect of sort of the deconstructor in some sense. It doesn't really map perfectly though, you're right. And so anyways, it's hard to really prove or disprove any of what I'm saying, but I think it's interesting to think about.
No, I definitely agree that I like to use the words like structure versus fluidity instead of order and chaos, 'cause I think
Mm,
there's less normative uh, equivocation going on.
right, right. That's good.
But I definitely agree that evolution would, like I said, take advantage of those patterns, and then we would embody them as a human species, and then the male and female would emphasize different aspects of them. But at the same time, because it's such a fundamental process of building up and breaking down, we'd also like have to have some aspects of the other one as well.
Yeah.
Like within your own mind, you can't only build or you can't only deconstruct.
Right, right. And there's also in the mind there's like this notion of like left and right brain. I think they kind of exhibit something that kind of relates to this as sort of it's just like sort of the unknown and unknown, sort of the known and unknown portions of the brain, or kind of the construct, sort of deconstruct, or as you said, like construct sort of liquidity kind of thing, which I think is
Yeah,
really interesting.
yeah. I mean, I definitely recommend Ian McGilchrist's work on that. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but his book, I think,
The
in some
master and his
sense,
emissary.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, excellent. In some sense, has a more triadic loop where the right hemisphere has like direct contact with reality, and then the left hemisphere breaks it down into its own internal structure to like analyze it. Like it breaks it down to features instead of the original gestalt,
Yeah.
and then you have to reintegrate it and generalize it back in order to make it intuitive and make it a new gestalt after you've understood the parts once again. So I'm not sure if you could map yin and yang to the right hemisphere and left hemisphere. He argues that the right hemisphere is just kind of supposed to be, well, the master, like more primary in that sense.
Yeah.
But it's definitely somewhat related. Yes.
Interesting. Um, what do you think? What do you think needs to happen for the masculine yin, let's say, or the feminine yang to kind of manifest more? What are the kind of changes do you think maybe that like need to happen, or maybe are happening right now, and like where does that come from? Would you say? Maybe in yourself, even like how do you see it in yourself at play? How do you see it maybe developing? Or
Yeah. Having some kind of like disciplined practice. I think the move to like meditation and mindfulness. Actually, that's kind of interesting. I think meditation is in some sense like 100% yin, but there's both a masculine and feminine aspect to it. Like the masculine would be where you keep your focus on one thing, like regardless of distractions, and you have the structure of that focus, and then the feminine yin would be more like the opening to whatever is occurring and like being with it in that moment and being receptive to it. So I think at least half of that is the masculine yin, like giving people more internal structure
yeah,
in a kind of liminal phase of culture and so on. I think also, yeah. So speaking from personal experience, I guess I should go back a bit. Where growing up, I was like hyper introverted, and yet also felt that I embodied masculinity from what I understood. There's just like no extroversion within it.
yeah,
So I was imbalanced in terms of extroversion and introversion, but that definitely gave me a sense of what the kind of feeling of masculine yin was, and I think somewhat individual activities like having a individual exercise routine would kind of fall into that as well, for example. And I do think you can see some degree of that. Uh, you can also kind of map them to the big five. I'm not sure if this is helpful or if it's just like an interesting thing
yeah,
where
sure.
the feminine yang, I think in some sense could be seen as openness,
Mm,
feminine yin as agreeableness, and then the two masculine ones are a little more complicated. There was a guy who wrote an interesting article. I can link it to you afterward,
sure.
where he had masculine yang as extroversion, especially the assertiveness part, and then masculine yin as conscientiousness. I
Mm,
think you could also make the case that masculine yang is more industriousness, which is like a subgroup of conscientiousness, and then masculine yin is orderliness, which is a subgroup of conscientiousness.
yeah,
Because like
interesting.
once again, I kind of map introversion and extroversion as more fundamental than that.
Mm.
Yeah, actually, there was another thing about that I want to go into, but if you have anything to respond to this first.
Uh, Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, you know, personally, the the masculine yin, I think, is more of sort of my default way of being, and I think that that's who I was as a child for a really long time. And I think that I was someone who was pretty patient and very observant, and kind of didn't really have any other instinct other than to kind of stay in the background and kind of try to sort of make sense of what was going on and sort of wait for the right time and um to
I
be
relate to this completely.
yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because at a certain point in my life, I felt like the masculine yawn had to take over because I felt weak and I felt like I was sort of falling behind in many ways. And um, it's funny, I actually just recorded a podcast about this with another friend about like this sort of transformation I had in my life. But, anyways, there was this like switch for me where I kind of went from being the sort of in the background, sort of patient observer who doesn't speak very much, to feeling like I had to sort of become someone who was more aggressive and more active and more in the foreground. But that transformation was really unbalanced for me, and it was almost like I was sort of pretending, because I felt like I had to. So
Mm.
um, that kind of version of me, which sort of became like this sort of like impervious giant that kind of like took over and like took care of business, and that kind of became my like primary personality that I relied upon. And it worked for me for a while, but it did there was sort of this disconnection that happened with me, or this kind of closing off of this more open, receptive version of me. And the stereotype of this of like I just sort of repressed a lot of like
Yeah.
my feelings. I repressed a lot of this kind of notion of openness and gentleness and this sort of lovingness almost that was within me, to sort of become someone who was like more of like a warrior, who was like really in charge. And um, I feel like just now, well, I'd say the last like 5 years, but especially in the last 2 years, there's kind of been a reopening of of the masculine yin, of like coming back to this place of like openness and sort of letting my guard down a little bit, because my guard's up way too much. And it's okay to like just like be a little more receptive, be a little more open, be a little more in the background, let things flow and not worry too much about having to like control the flow all the time. And so that's sort of I find this paradigm useful in thinking about myself that way, of this sort of strange, volatile oscillation between this like yin and yang, and like trying to find a place where they are actually in harmony more so within me, which I think is interesting to think about, because it's really not like me going from being feminine to being masculine to being feminine. It's like
Right.
that's not really how I think of it. It's more like it's all masculine. It all seems very masculine, but there is sort of like this other dualism. It's not a true dualism, obviously, but this sort of notion of something else flipping inside me that I think is really interesting to talk about. Um,
Yeah, I mean, it seems somewhat similar to introversion and extroversion. Like at some point, you have to, or after you've built up so much internal structure, if you don't do anything with it, then it, in some sense, it eventually would be kind of a waste. At least that's how I think about it. But you need to have like the capacity for both, ideally.
yeah,
You don't like a lukewarm compromise constantly. Of course, it depends on the context. And then when you do like move into a function that you're not as familiar with, it can feel like pretending in some sense, because you're just kind of modeling what you've seen it look like. I think in the initial stages that's almost inevitable, and
right.
because I always had like a strong desire for authenticity, I think I avoided that step of like pretending and trying it out so much.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
yeah. Something else you mentioned I think is really interesting, that I'm not sure exactly how to articulate this, but you're talking about the big five traits, let's say, and you're talking about conscientiousness. And within conscientiousness, like nested within conscientiousness, there's sort of industriousness and orderliness. And you're putting forward this notion of industriousness as being uh, yang, like masculine yang, and orderliness as being masculine yin. Is that what you said?
Yeah, because they're both like ordering and structuring
Yeah,
functions, but one is more externally directed and one is more, I mean, it's orderliness is still external technically, but
yeah.
it's, I mean, for like introverted thinking in the Myers-Briggs, it's like having a set of systematic definitions for things, which is in your mind as well as the world, but you're not really necessarily affecting the world directly. You're like
Mm.
classifying and having a structure so that when you do act, it's directed properly.
Interesting. Yeah. So there's a sort of feeling of like nesting of yin and yang, right? Almost as if you could keep kind of going further within and finding more dualisms of yin and yang that are emerging. Like within conscientiousness, you might have this yin and yang of industriousness and orderliness. And then within orderliness, you might have a sort of yin and yang within that of like, how does
Mm.
orderliness manifest? And then maybe within those, there's sort of these forces at work. Um, the same way you were talking about meditation as being sort of a
Mm.
yin thing, but then within meditation, there's almost like a yin yang thing happening,
Yeah.
and that's sort of nested within that. What do you think about this idea of this kind of like hierarchical sort of nesting up and down?
Yeah, I'd be curious to look at the subcategories for the other big five traits. But
Yeah.
as far as meditation, I felt like it was like 50% masculine and 50% feminine, depending on whether you're concentrating or opening up.
Mm.
But uh, like, how would you see yang fitting into meditation specifically? Just the structure aspect?
Um, well, I think like Vervaeke sort of talks about this, the practice of meditation can involve sort of um, the breathing, it's like sort of like breaking down the gestalts into features, right?
Mhm.
But then turning the features back into gestalts and sort of going up and down and like
Meditation and contemplation, he calls it.
yeah, right. So I can't remember the other terminology used, but there's sort of like a um something that's more associated with like Christian contemplation. I think he was saying that sort of like this notion of like the upward construction of kind of bringing everything together into, I can't remember what he said, but
I, I think that does map to contemplatio, he said, like the
yeah.
typical, and that's traditionally been more of the mystical tradition
Mm,
of the West, whereas meditation, like going down to the single point of attention, being more
right.
the tradition of the East to some extent.
Right. And then I think he's talking about this notion of non-dualism or something, or where you can kind of be at both at the same time.
Yes, prajna.
Right. So there is sort of like this the meditative act is perhaps kind of yin, but then within that there is sort of a yang and yin aspect of it, perhaps.
Oh,
And
actually, yes, I finally understand what you mean now. The
yeah,
contemplation is the yang,
yeah.
and I've talked to him before about seeing contemplation as containing like gratitude journaling as part of it
Mm,
in some sense, because you're kind
yeah,
of putting your energy out towards something, even if you're not talking to the thing or the person you're grateful for directly.
yeah.
So yeah, I think the combination of meditation going into the features and contemplation expanding outward to the gestalts could be construed as yin and yang in some sense. That's a good point.
Anyway, so this is like deep metaphysical talk, but I think it's sort of interesting to imagine that the universe is somewhat structured in this way hierarchically. Is there's kind of like a dualisms within dualisms within dualisms that actually create uh, what reality is, which is a huge complexity, like vast complexity, but that it can actually sort of um, be organized into this sort of chaos order, perhaps, or yin yang, or fluidity versus
Structure.
solidness or structure. Yeah, that is sort of like permeating through all things, um, and that we see manifest perhaps in all things, but maybe it's hard to kind of identify which is which, or if it's actually happening. But anyways, that gets pretty abstract. So
Yeah, I traditionally feel like a kind of a monism with an infinite number of complex dualities stemming from the single gestalt is more the tack I take, but that, like I said, would still include like infinite numbers of dualisms, and the primary dualism may well be the one we've been talking about of yin and yang.
yeah. Yeah.
And then another one, well, not another one, we've been over it, but I had the
Yeah.
idea of introversion and extroversion as possibly like predating um, sex in evolutionary terms,
Sure.
as like approach and avoid behavior to some degree, like
Okay.
conservation. Once you got the encephalization of the brain in organisms, whether
Mm.
they want to go toward food or like stay back and protect themselves,
Yeah.
as more fundamental. And then, yeah, and then in some sense, I think actually Jung talked about this notion
Mm.
that introverts are in some sense specialized in survival and like natural selection, and then extroverts in reproduction and sexual selection as a kind of balance within the tribe. So
Interesting.
extroverts would like take more risks, and then also be more promiscuous to some degree, whereas introverts would kind of like be more concerned about survival, obviously, and then perhaps be more familiar with. Well, actually, I think it was Jordan Peterson who tried to map introversion to nature and then extroversion to like culture. That's sort of related, but yeah, I'd be curious what you think about that idea.
Yeah, yeah, I think that resonates. I mean, the introversion as survival and the extroversion as reproductive success, maybe.
Yeah.
There is this understanding I have of humans, at least, I guess. There is sort of this energy of sort of holding down the fort, or sort of maintaining the life energy in some sense and protecting it, and then the energy that goes out to uh, range and find resources or explore and bring them back to the core energy. And that kind of is this sort of feminine and masculine energy going on. The sort of um, the birthing, obviously, like holding within you the actual child, is something that women do, and they are sort of protecting the core like life energy. They are birthing it. They are uh, doing most of the child rearing, and they're better at it, and so they're kind of protecting this energy in this very um, kind of stationary way almost. And then
Hmm.
the masculine energy is very much one that takes more risks, that is more expendable, that is sort of sent out to kind of do things that sort of bend nature to their will. And that's sort of dangerous because you kind of have to dive into nature and sort of enter that chaos. And um, the whole notion of hunting and gathering is something that men would primarily do, which is go out and hunt and do all the dangerous things. And you can afford to lose men to a certain extent, but you can't really afford to lose the women, or the tribe is likely to die. It's likely to fail. And so that kind of risk taking extroversion kind of maps onto masculine, I think, pretty well, where sort of the less risk taking, more kind of maintaining a safe like survival place, and kind of holding that energy, like keeping the fire going almost, while the men go out to find more wood. It's like a metaphor I like, is like the women are keeping the fire going
Hmm.
inside themselves, and the men are in charge of like going out to find things to feed the fire. And so um, I think that maps on quite nicely to that notion as far as like the evolutionary history of men and women. Um, and the promiscuity idea, I think, is interesting. But I mean, I guess we tend to think of men as being more promiscuous
Yeah, I guess
typically.
I'm saying within men and then separately within women, there
Mm,
would be selective pressures, like kind of an opponent processing thing of a balance
yeah.
between those who are more promiscuous and those who are less promiscuous.
Mm,
And then it might generalize to like the extroverted notion of um, going with the energy of whatever situation is going on and being more trusting in some sense, um, rather than like keeping up the protective borders for survival.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely uh, the notion that men are competing um, in some sense, and that there are certain men who are going to play a more active role in making decisions, and also um, reproducing, and that the other men won't reproduce and they won't play such an active role. They're kind of going to play a more supportive role. So I do think within men, there's also this active passive thing going on. That
Yeah, I mean, there's like the shamanic caste who aren't traditionally, well, I'm not sure
right,
whether they traditionally were fathers.
yeah,
That's something I'd want to look into. But
sure,
because there was often like the polygyny, there would be some men who would take on different roles within the community, like the archetype of like the hermit just outside the village who
right,
has a bunch of strange knowledge, that sort of thing would be an introverted masculine archetype.
yeah. Yeah, and I think I think even now you can sort of see this pattern within men. They do this is they have a tendency to kind of um, vote someone to the top to be in charge, to kind of rally behind a leader, and that they might compete to sort of choose someone to kind of be in charge, but they also might, like violently, like they might fight to see who's in charge. But in other ways, they might actually come to sort of a cooperative diplomatic solution of being a team of like, we vote this guy to be in charge. Like we do that when we socialize, like even in a, at like a barbecue or something like that. It's like there is a tendency for certain people to kind of take the lead in socializing, to organize what's happening at the party. And um, the people that we like a lot, the people that we find to be the most worthy of being in charge, will support them in doing that, and people will kind of rally behind that. So there's this pattern that we have that's very tribal, that works very well for sort of finding this happy balance between the extroverted and introverted to create sort of a successful group, I think. Um, so
Yeah, I think Alexander Bard's work, I don't know if you're familiar with his, is interesting here, where he has the
mm,
notion of kind of the triarchy of the traditional tribe, where
mm,
there's the chieftain, the priest, and the matriarch.
mm,
Um, and you might be able to, he has the idea of the need for a split phallus, whereas if they try to fuse the role of the priest of like religion and the chieftain
mm,
of like leadership, then it can lead to more like a tyrant, basically. Whereas if you have that dynamic opponent processing model, then they can each have their own specialization and compensate for the other one. And I think to some extent you could make the case that like the chieftain vocation, there would be other roles within the tribe as well, but these are like two of the main ones, would be more of the extroverted masculine yang, and then the priest, who's kind of like, or the shaman, like the lore
yeah,
keeper, would be more masculine yin, who like knows the structure more like the mental mythical sense.
yeah. I
Yeah,
like that. I like that. That's good, actually. That's very interesting to think about. And yeah, the triarchy, the sort of splitting of men, I think, is something that we see, and that there is more of a uh, dynamic sort of role that men play that is a little more widespread than what women play. I think women tend to play a more focused role, whereas men seem to kind of spread out as far as the roles they play. And
yeah,
I think the chieftain, the priest and chieftain notion of certain ways of gravitating for men to kind of go in these directions. I think we do see that play out in our society. And I would say, like, for instance, probably you and I probably occupy more of a like priest role,
yeah,
of more of a shamanic role of kind
yeah.
of having interests that align with that more so than the chieftain role. But um, yeah,
I
that's
think
good.
it also, I mean, you can kind of simplify it by saying like the brains versus bronze, or like the mind and the body, even though you need
Mm,
to have some balance of both, but there's a specialization that like uh, Bard talks about, that men can appreciate each other's vocational specialization while still like finding their own archetype.
mm,
And then I think it also is interesting. I agree with you that men would probably evolutionarily have more of a range of possible roles just because of like polygyny and so on.
yeah,
Some wouldn't get to be fathers necessarily, which might also be related to the finding that like IQ in men and women, men are like either they have a more widespread distribution of like
right,
very high
right,
but very low, whereas women are more clustered in the center. I
yeah,
think that's also probably related.
interesting.
That might
Yeah,
give some credence to the archetype of like the just like the dumb muscle. There may have been a role for that
right,
evolutionarily. I
yeah,
don't know about now so much. That's kind of an interesting thing to see whether the chieftain, like the new role of the chieftain, is I think something our civilization is grappling with right now. Like Bard makes the case that we're still kind of traumatized from what he calls the false phalluses of like Hitler and Stalin, where they had a vision, but they tried to have total power of like both the priest and the chieftain instead of having a dynamic balance. And right now, I feel like there is possibly kind of like a resurgence of the shadow of like the repressed masculine. Well, I guess you could say the masculine in general, but the masculine yang, because it's more of the chieftain's role right now that you can see in like the alt-right and so on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. That kind of that does open up some like new interesting ideas of how to think about this. But yeah, the range of male manifestation or masculine manifestation in the world, and how that is a natural organization that can become pathological or can become corrupted. I think it's sort of interesting. The idea of trying to play all the roles at once is like not going to work very well, or it's going to create a disbalance. And I think that something else that kind of brings up for me that maybe is or is not related is the, I think, the propensity for men to feel like they don't have a role, and how emasculating that is, right? Is that like something that's very important to men, I think, is to feel like they are doing something that's that has a purpose, or that is useful. Like men really like feeling useful, and you even see this, I think, in little boys often. Is like there's this kind of notion of like, hey, do you want a job like Timmy? And they're like, yeah, like what do you want me to do? It's like, I need you to go take out the trash. And it's like, okay. And I think that's more prominent in men, is sort of wanting to feel useful. And so I think one of the problems that we are facing now, and I think part of the meaning crisis, you might say, for men, is the pervasiveness of men not having a role, or not having a job to do, and grappling with that of like, well, my identity is gone, because what am I supposed to do? What can I do? And how pernicious that is probably to society, when you have this pattern at work where there's a lot of men who have nothing to do. And I think we're seeing that. So I think a lot of what we think of as being the pathological masculine, and like maybe a lot of the forces like that might be associated with the alt-right, there is sort of this festering energy of men who don't have a role.
Yeah. I think in some sense that's why it's necessary for religion to have a kind of role that goes beyond like a very egoistic telos of, for example, like I guess they call it the manosphere, where I feel like in some sense they make masculinity itself their telos, when that should only ever be used as like an energy that you have that is directed toward a greater purpose than just being masculine itself, or even like being successful within a system of making money, or being athletic, or whatever, or getting lots of women. Like without the priest's role, which in some sense Bard makes the argument was done away with the after the, was it the 30 Years War, with like the separation of church and state, basically, where the state kind of like religion still existed. It was just bad religion, as he calls it, and kind of plundered the world. And then the traditional religions became kind of impotent, and obviously need updating, which is why I think Vervaeke's work is really important right now, because to have some sort of a higher purpose that is properly grounded with our best understanding of reality, so not sliding back into fundamentalism, but nor taking the path for a lot of young men of just having a purpose that is like purely biological, so like being masculine and being successful in the dating market or so on, which is not a very like healthy purpose in the long run for themselves or society.
Yeah. This might be a difficult question, but I'm gonna try and throw it out there anyways. If if masculinity, let's say, is a means to an end, and it should not be an end in itself, what do you think is the end then? Like, you know,
Yeah.
like how might you describe that? I know this is like a difficult question, but I
No,
think,
totally.
yeah,
It'd be worth a podcast on its own.
yeah,
So I think part of it would be like the actualization of new potential in service to that capacity being able to like sustain itself and grow in some sense. So it doesn't eliminate its own capacity for generating more actualization of potential. And then just like general well-being, like eudaimonia, the Greek term, that's not just like pleasure or shallow happiness,
yeah,
for the whole, like potentially including, um, well, definitely including like care for the environment, because that would kind of terminate the loop. So I do think that's an issue right now. Um, and I think to some degree it will be individual, depending on like the archetype of the man or the person, what that
yeah,
purpose would be.
mm,
Uh, but it would be kind of I mean, there's also like the notion of the true, the beautiful, and the good as kind of the triarchy of sacredness. And I think also what Vervaeke talks about of agape as being the only thing that's intrinsically meaningful, because it is the affordance of meaning and meaning makers going into the future. So those are some of the things that I kind of try to put at that spot, because for a while I was looking for like what is, the highest purpose, and getting very deep into metaphysics and so on.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's it's the question, I think, and yeah, the YouTube series I'm working on is going to be aimed at that question and sort of, you know, figuring out how can we try and make sense of this, or how can we even have conversations about this without necessarily arriving at the answer, which I think is an impossible task. But
Yeah, I
yeah,
like the notion of an open-ended telos because of the importance of evolution, like an emergence of new forms of life.
right.
Yeah, I'd definitely be curious about that, about the like what is purpose. I'm assuming I'd definitely be curious about your thoughts or that series.
Yeah, I mean the series is called The Torch, and that's just a metaphor. And I think a lot of the work I've done has been developing this sort of perception of like what is it that life does, or what is it that humans do, and what is the end, and like everything is sort of a means to an end. What's the end here? Um, and I like the idea of the open-ended telos. I think is interesting. That's something that I've thought about as well. But just in basic terms, I think that humans are sort of the bearers of a torch, and that we have children, and the children receive the torch from us, and they have to keep carrying it into the future. And that the torch is not just purely genetics; it's also cultural. But there's this notion that like our lives kind of revolve around this thing. Like a lot of the meaning in our lives, the purpose that we have is derived from this notion that we are carrying some sort of energy within us, and we're sort of like you were saying, actualization. We're like bringing it into being, it's becoming, and we're kind of feeding it with our lives. And then like at some point as individuals, like our bodies deteriorate, and we have to die, we have to go away, but we want to pass on that energy to keep it going. um and I think that a lot of what we consider meaningful is something involving that, and a lot of what we consider to be like catastrophic and tragic and terrible is when that energy either gets extinguished or it gets doused quite a bit. It's terrible. Like if your child dies, there's this
Mhm.
feeling of like your torch has been extinguished, and that people really find that to be a catastrophic thing to happen. But also just like when we're spiritually starved, there is also this notion of like in this realm of mind and culture and spiritual energy that can also become extinguished over time. And I think that has happened. And I think that we're experiencing that now, that it's sort of this torch is sort of burning very low spiritually, and that we're perceiving the world as being very meaningless because of that. And I think the meaning crisis kind of has to do with this sort of like what happened to this task, this sort of meta task that we were all part of, this carrying of the torch? It's like I feel disconnected from that, and therefore my life feels meaningless. And I think a lot of the crises we're experiencing are kind of a result of that, this sort of this spiritual starvation. Anyways, so that was kind of a long answer, but
no, that's really good.
yeah.
And I think once again, like the resurgence of in young men, the desire for a purpose among like the alt-right, it's almost as though they, because it's readily available or obvious, bring it down to the level of like trying to understand just natural selection, the continuity of the species as itself, as the telos, like having, you know, enough children.
Yeah.
Whereas I think once culture emerged, like self-reflective life, there's something more than just the repetition of the species itself, because like you still have to bring well-being and flourishing within it, and then a connection to something higher than just repeating survival in some sense, or even survival plus reproduction alone.
Yeah. The and I think with the emergence of self-reflective life of culture, as you're saying, I think we do start to sort of transcend the genetics and just having children and having lots and lots and lots of children. I mean, that's still obviously a big facet of our existence. You can't just get rid of that, but this emergence of consciousness does change this energy, and it becomes something new. It kind of transcends into something else, and I think that it's unclear where it's going or what it could become, that energy, and that sort of open-ended telos, I think, is sort of interesting in that way. It's like we don't know what our collective energy, what it means or where it's going, but it might transcend us into something else. And I think it's fair to say that we have sort of a duty to kind of protect that energy and like see where it goes, or sort of, even if that means handing it off to something else. Like,
yeah, I think that's the big question right now that we're grappling with. And the open-endedness, I think, like you said, it's important for having that kind of humility, like epistemic humility, and just in general, and that sort of like awe, or proper reverence, as Vervaeke talks about, which he actually just made the argument for reverence as essential to rationality as aspirational adaptivity, which affords that. And I also think like the notion of Greg Henriquez, his colleague that he's been having talks about, of his model of the tree of life, of the different emergence points of, first you have time, space, and energy, then matter emerges, then life, and then the mind, like the brain, and then culture as self-justification systems for behavior of groups. And now we're at the next emergence vector point. And for that reason, for sure, like you still need the purpose, but because there's some kind of new emergence going on with a metaculture, as he calls it, because we don't really know what it is yet. But it's like culture is now being subsumed by something larger where there's multiple cultures within it, but it's still a whole gestalt. You need that humility still, because you don't want to like prematurely say this is the purpose, nor do you want to go back and say, oh, the purpose is just survival of the species again, and like have as much children as possible and being like the traditional man or woman, as some of the more reactionaries might say. But you still need some sort of purpose, and need to like understand the adjacent possible of what is emerging to some degree.
That's good. Yeah, I feel like we perhaps are ending this conversation at a pretty open-ended, expansive question mark, because there's a lot there that I think would be really fun to explore. But do you have any projects in the mix that you want to tell me about or advertise a little bit? Like, what are you working on exactly? Or
mostly I've been working on my own like artistic projects for the book and a game, but I definitely following Vervaeke's conversations and the Discord, and your podcast. I just discovered, I've listened to a couple episodes on like thinking and feeling. So cool. Yeah, I'd definitely be interested in doing more of this sort of thing, just general thinkers of these topics, like the intellectual deep web and so on. I'm very much interested in that at the same time.
Cool. Well, yeah, it was good talking to you. We're at an hour. I think that's enough time for now, but it'd be cool to talk again. I think that we have a lot of overlap in what we're interested in and our ideas. So this has been really fruitful, I think. So
Yeah, same. Thanks.
cool, man. Good talking to you, Connor.